Can you guys still see my screen? Awesome. Hey, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for tuning in and joining us. I am Cheyenne Meadows, and I'm the High Ability Learning Specialist at the Nebraska Department of Education. Today, I'm going to be joined by Tessa Frass from Nebraska MTSS, and she's going to introduce herself in a moment. And today, we're going to be talking about a new initiative that we are working on. The Nebraska Department of Education and NEMTSS is working on a HAL and MTSS Pilot. And we're going to talk today about a little bit of an overview of MTSS, how it connects to HAL, and then what the pilot project is going to consist of. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tessa.
All right, thanks, Cheyenne. So yes, again, I am Tessa Frost, and I am the Nebraska MTSS Regional Support Lead for Region 5, so the western side of the state, and I get to work closely with ESU 13, 15, and 16. So I'm always excited to work with Cheyenne. She is amazing and definitely an awesome advocate for HAL programs. So the first thing, I know this isn't interactive, and many of you will probably just be watching the recording, but I just want you to think about, when you hear MTSS, what comes to mind? So you might be thinking about things like tiers and interventions, maybe academics, maybe special education. There's lots of different views and perspectives about MTSS, and I think some of that confusion has come out of response to intervention RTI, and that wasn't the intent. You know, RTI was meant for good things and to provide all needs for all kids, but it really started becoming more about special ed education verification, and the keyword being response. So it sort of became more of that wait to fail model. And so I'm happy to be here today to just give you a quick overview about MTSS. So equity-based MTSS really truly is a system for all that meets the needs for each student. And I think there's not one of us in education that isn't here to meet the needs of each student that we have the opportunity to work with. So it's that organizing framework to make sure that that happens. So a conceptual framework for Nebraska MTSS, we've got to have that pyramid triangle when we talk about MTSS, but we really focus on that core instruction. So the tier 1, where all students are receiving that high quality core academic, social, emotional, behavioral instruction. Again, it's about all students. And then tier 2 interventions are for students who need those additional supports. They may receive focused, targeted small group instruction. And again, that is in addition to the core. So we're not replacing the core for kids who need tier 2 or tier 3 interventions. And then our tier 3 students is for more intensive interventions, that intensified instruction based on the individual student need, in addition to the core that all kids receive. So again, this isn't interactive, but what I would like you to think about, so we all have strengths, we all have weaknesses, and they're all different. And sometimes we're solid and we've got it, and sometimes we might need a little bit more help with something. So I'm just going to throw out some random topics or skills or subjects, and I want you to think, okay, if I was going to do this right now, would I be tier 1? Do I just need core instruction, or do I need some interventions to help me be successful? Or do I need some intensified instruction? So think about cooking. So if you're really good at cooking, it just kind of comes natural and you knock it out of the park, then you're probably really good with core instruction and you don't need those intensified instruction. So now think about algebra. Okay, for me, Math, I have some anxiety sometimes when it comes to math. And so I would probably be at a tier 2, depending on the level of the math. So now I want you to think about crocheting. Would you be a 1, a 2, or a 3? Maybe you're so good at crocheting that you need to learn a different skill, or a more, I don't know, better technique or something, a really cool way to crochet. So one thing I want you to think about as you were thinking about whether you were core or tier 2 or tier 3, you probably weren't tier 1 for every single thing I said, or just tier 2. And so we need to remember that we're labeling that behavior and the skill, not us or the child as a person. So if we need tier 3 support in one area, say algebra, that doesn't mean that I need tier 3 in cooking or science, perhaps. So I just think that's a good way to frame it and maybe understand it a little bit better. But we just, and we also want to make sure that we don't leave someone in a tier forever. That's not their life sentence. We give them the support they need. Hopefully at some point they're good to go, and they don't need those intensified instruction supports any longer. So our Nebraska MTSS mission is to empower schools to support and prepare all Nebraska students for success. And I love that the word empower is in here, because it really truly is about empowering all of you when you're working with students every single day. And so thinking about the mission statement that you have for your school and how does that align? So why MTSS? Well, we know in education there are parameters, there are have-tos that we have to make sure that we check the boxes, but it really truly is more than just about doing what we have to do. It's grounded in research. It certainly can help reduce those SLD verifications. Again, it's not in that wait to fail model, so we're not reactive, we're preventative, making sure that we have that organized framework. As you can see in that picture, we've got strong foundational practices at the bottom, and then we have that blue door, which is the core where all students go through. All students are receiving the high quality academic, social, emotional, and behavior, and then remembering the intensified instruction is in addition to that core. So the quote, "When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower." So as professional educators, it really truly is up to us. And we need to do what needs to be done to meet the needs of each student. You know, I've always said we can only control what we can control, and we can definitely control ourselves as professional educators. And so when we think about a flower doesn't need to be fixed. Just like a kid, we can have our high ability students, we have ones with disabilities, we have students in between, you know, kids that are needing support at one time and then not needing support another time. And so it's up to us to make sure that we provide the environment for those students so they're growing. All kids are growing. So for instance, with a flower, maybe the flower needs more sunlight or less sunlight, or maybe more water. Some, like succulents, I've overwatered them. So you know, really making sure that we're providing the right environment for them. So in addition, as you all know, in the world of education, there's no way you can do this alone. Absolutely no way. And so this is that the importance of building those systems of support. We want to make sure that we have the best impact, the most impact, and we have to come together and do that collectively. And having that strong core saves those resources for kids who need that intensified instruction in tier 2 and tier 3. And, you know, we like to say that you can't intervene your way out of a bad core, which is just the same thing as you can't out-train a bad diet, which the first time someone said that to me, I was like, oh, gosh. So it's really important that we have those systems in place and that we're all on the same page. So that brings us into efficacy and having that self-efficacy, the educator efficacy, and then that collective educator efficacy, really that we're all hands on deck together. We have that collective belief of educators working together to really positively affect students. And so I just wanted to throw in a little bit of research. I'm sure you've all heard of John Hattie. Just to kind of give you some context, based on the research, an effect size of 0.4 is believed to represent a year's worth of growth in a year's time. So just 0.4. And I know this is probably really hard to see, but at the very top of this bar graph, it's collective teacher efficacy, and it's 1.57. I mean, to me, that's mind-blowing, the power that of the impact we can have when we have that collective teacher efficacy. And that's really what MTSS is all about. It's providing teachers with the support that you all need to do your jobs well, including, you know, the high quality materials, trainings, evidence-based practices, time, which we all want more of for sure. So every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. Sometimes this one can kind of sit a little hard. And I think, you know, when we talked about collective efficacy, we know there's no way one person can have the impact they should have for every single student. So we need to analyze our systems and fine tune our systems to make sure that we're getting the results that we want and need and feel proud of for our students, that we're meeting the needs of each student. And I think about when you put together a puzzle, if you're missing a piece or two, you know, when you finish the puzzle and you've got missing pieces, it's probably not something you're going to proudly display on your wall. And so making sure that, you know, we do that foundational work to make sure that the system creates the results that you're proud to be a part of. These are our 6 essential elements, and I'm not going to go in, you know, to great depth right now, but I know Cheyenne's going to talk about them here in just a little bit. But it's the foundation for the work that we do with Nebraska MTSS, and they really are what they say they are at face value. So, you know, shared leadership is just what it says. It's about you know, that team approach. It doesn't all fall on one's shoulders. And you know, we talk about making sure we're not putting more work on your plates, because educators have a lot of work already. And believe it or not, the work that you currently are doing fits in these pieces somewhere. But going back to the importance of creating that strong foundation to make sure that those resources are organized so kids get help early, we're doing stuff that works, and you have the support that you need. So it really comes down to continuous school improvement. And I really liked this image because of the weights on the side. And when I read this, I thought, okay, just like myself, I can't expect to work out once a week and get the results that I may think I want or expect. And so it's the same in our schools. It's about that consistent problem solving, and that we're always having those conversations, and we have systems in place to make sure that we have the results that our kids deserve. And I would be remiss to not share this. This is the implementation science. And I share this because this was an area that I struggled with as an administrator in terms of really realizing that this takes time. And as you can see, there's an arrow that goes both directions on the bottom of the slide, and it says 2 to 4 years. It really can take up to 4, sometimes 5 years to really have a deeply implemented system in your schools where it's just the way you do business. So we talk about we don't want to add anything to your plates. And at the beginning, it might feel that way, but it's an investment. So there is some of that upfront work, but it will pay dividends once that becomes just the way that you do business. It's definitely one that you go slow to go fast. You're going to have productive struggle, and it's part of that process. And sometimes you may have to take a step or two back to keep moving forward. And I just want to be transparent. And let you know that now it's not a, yep, we're going to get this in place tomorrow, even though we all want that. It's important that we trust that process.
Thank you, Tessa, for such a great overview of MTSS. And I am so lucky to be part of the MTSS team. And this venture is really truly a partnership that we forged. And we want to ensure that we're meeting the needs of all students, and in particular, the needs of high ability learners. We know sometimes maybe fall to the wayside. So we want to use this multi-tiered systems of support framework to support high ability learners. And the goal of this true partnership is not to see everything as siloed or separate things, and not like high ability is another thing we have to do, and SEL is another thing we have to do. It's kind of to make sure that we have these systems in place to make everything connect and extend our thinking, especially towards populations such as high ability learners. And I really like to start all of my kind of spiels with this idea of why is this important for high ability learners? And there are several myths that kind of circulate around and kind of are detrimental to high ability education. And so something that we hear kind of often is that gifted students don't need any help. They'll be fine on their own. When in reality, high ability learners need supports, and they need challenges, and they need services in order to reach their full potential. Just because they can access the grade level curriculum and beyond does not mean that they don't deserve to learn something new every day. Boredom and frustration can cause behavioral issues. It can cause a variety of academic issues and self-efficacy issues. So it really is true that high ability learners are a population that have differing needs and require differing services. Or I hear this one all the time, like that kid can't possibly be gifted, they're receiving poor grades. And something that we have to look at is sometimes when students become bored, they lose interest, or if they feel like they get something, they don't understand why they have to do it 2 or 3 times. And so maybe they're not turning things in, or maybe they're afraid to be the smart kid in class because they're going to get made fun of, or because they don't want to appear a know-it-all. These scenarios can cause these students to have poor grades, especially if they're not interested in the subject. Finally, it is a myth that gifted programs require an abundance of resources. I know what each and every district gets to fund their HAL programs, and I know it's not a lot, but there are things we can do to support these students. It can be kind of a daunting task to think about developing a HAL program, but the first step is acknowledging their needs, and providing appropriate curriculum within the school day is a great step towards servicing these students. So if we look at this graph, as we move towards more heavily towards growth measures such as the INSCAS growth, and a lot of people already look at MAP growth. This is a graph that came out in 2008, but there's been more updated research that kind of shows similarly that this green line here is proficient. And so we see student A starts way up here and throughout the school year, they regress, but they're still above that proficient line. And then we see this student who maybe starts at a lower spot and they make a massive amount of gain throughout the school year, but they're not at that proficient line. So what we see often is this student who starts really high, because they're above that proficient line, they're not receiving services or additional extensions or anything like that because they're above that proficient line. And so we shouldn't worry about them. Whereas this student has an opportunity to make massive amounts of gains, and we're still going to continue to look, how can we help this student because they're not reaching proficient? And so high ability students are often the ones that make the least amount of growth in a school year. That can be for lack of opportunity to proceed at their own pace, lack of challenge, lack of accelerated courses. And I love this quote that came from an article that says, gifted students have special needs and they are at risk of learning the least in the classroom. And that's really powerful to think that there's a whole population of students maybe we're not looking at. There's also a lot of affective implications for these students. So underachievement is when a student's potential and their performance are discrepant. So if we know a student has a really great IQ or their performance should be really high, but it's not, we kind of have this underachievement pattern of maybe, again, they're bored and they've lost interest, or maybe they've decided, maybe they hate school because they feel like they don't fit in, or there are a lot of different things that can cause underachievement, but often these patterns follow them into like their college careers and things like that. And so it's a really dangerous pattern for students to fall into. Again, we can see poor attitudes towards school. If a student feels like they don't fit in the classroom, or if they feel like they don't have any friends, they can often feel socially isolated, especially if, nobody wants to talk about what they want to talk about, or nobody kind of gets them. Boredom is a really big one, which can cause disruptive behaviors, because if you have a kid who gets done with something, 10 minutes before everybody else, there's a chance they're going to go cause a disruption, or they're going to do something that's disruptive, and they're bored, they're done, they don't understand why they can't talk to their friend. Or sometimes it can be seen, a lot of high ability students can be referred for behavioral issues and for behavioral interventions, and when in reality a lot of times we can fix those things with appropriate curriculum. And another really great connection to this MTSS idea is that not all students are strong in all areas. Just because somebody is identified as a high ability learner does not mean that they are universally strong in everything. They may be really, really strong in math, but maybe they're not strong in ELA. Or twice exceptional students, this fits in really well. Twice exceptional is when a student is gifted and has a disability. So they could be gifted and dyslexic, or gifted in autism spectrum disorder, or gifted and hearing impaired. And so they need those different levels of support based on their different learning disabilities. And then we have low income and minority students who also do not show typical identification patterns due to backgrounds or due to different tests being used. There are a lot of different needs. And what we have found is that, maybe giftedness isn't this high IQ, or maybe it isn't this globally measured idea of intelligence, but maybe it's people who are outstanding performers in just a specific area. And so again, that's that idea of maybe they're tier 2 in math or in ELA because they have dyslexia, and maybe they need, tier 3 HAL services because they need to be accelerated in math. So we have these different ideas of high ability learners and what they look like. So with that being said, when I first started this position and I first started interacting with the MTSS team, it seems like a really natural connection. Most schools are already using an MTSS system. So if we can place high ability services into a familiar framework, services and outcomes will improve for all students. Again, this is about meeting the needs of all students and streamlining systems. Because HAL is usually a separate program and has a separate teacher or has a separate set of things that they do, we want to make sure that we're putting it within the system, and so that we are all on the same page, and we're not doing one more thing. The responsiveness of MTSS will improve student outcomes. as I mentioned, high ability students are the ones that are least likely to make growth in a year. So if we're using these responsive practices to give them what they need, it's going to improve their outcomes. And Tessa mentioned the importance of efficacy of educators. We know that a lot of educators don't feel comfortable differentiating or serving students who already know the grade level material. So if we can build that capacity and that efficacy of the teachers, it really is going to help all students. And that brings me back to the 6 essential elements, because as Tessa mentioned, I'm going to kind of point out there's a lot of things that you're already doing that fit within these essential elements, and why are these so important to creating your system and making it really strong with HAL. So if we think about shared leadership, it really ensures that the system is being implemented across all of the varying systems in the district, as well as allowing for good communications and a highly effective team. We need to start with strong leadership. So that usually starts at the administrative level and buy-in from everybody in the school. Shared leadership is also leveraging all stakeholders. So we want to talk to families, students, teachers, administrators, a lot of times counselors, especially when we think about school psychologists who administer tests to gifted students. Families, a lot of times, are the ones that see things in their children way before the school picks up on it, or getting community input to see just where we need improvement. And that communication is critical to creating that strong foundation, especially when we talk about identifying high ability learners. We want to make sure that everybody in the school is aware of those characteristics and what those pathways are to identification and how to best serve them. The next one is communication, collaboration, and partnership. We want to make sure that all staff members are aware of the problem-solving process, and that is a cornerstone of MTSS, is being able to use that problem-solving loop in order to make sure that we are doing what is effective and best for the students based on data and using that model. Visibility and awareness is really big, especially when we talk about high ability learning. Teaming up with the general education teachers not only helps them understand what the gifted facilitator does, but it also creates open lines of communication and the awareness of the needs of high ability learners. A lot of times when we think about shared responsibility, when we think about special education, or if we think about high ability learners, a lot of times we can see these patterns of, oh, those are Mrs. Smith's kids, or those are, the high ability kids. And so we want to make sure that we're having this idea, we're creating this idea of shared responsibility of everyone is responsible for all students, and not just the HAL teacher for the HAL students and special education teacher for the special ed students. We also want to make sure we're engaging inside of and outside of the school. We want to include parents in data and planning meetings and be engaging the community and receiving that feedback to provide, if they give us continuous feedback, we can continue to make improvements to our system. Another really strong piece is the evidence-based practices. And sometimes these get lost in high ability education because our teachers are responsible for differentiating for a wide range of students in the classroom, and evidence-based best practices for high ability learners are not always at the forefront of things, and especially if districts don't have resources or don't have a high ability teacher. And so if we think about evidence-based curriculum, instruction, intervention, and assessment, it looks different from the general education practices, and somehow students in the state still receive no services just because we don't, which is not a best practice to identify students and then not provide services. And many studies indicate that little to no differentiation for high ability students happen within the regular education classroom. And the way we're going to improve practice and the way we're going to help these students the most is with systemic differentiation for all. And that means, professional learning and doing things in order to better ourselves with evidence-based practices specific to teaching high ability learners. building capacity and infrastructure for implementation. What's really great about MTSS is that it creates this infrastructure for you and you build capacity through implementing the system. So if we can, again, if you have an MTSS system in place, inserting high ability learning into it's going to be a lot easier to build capacity and a lot easier because you have that infrastructure. And in a study done in 2008, they found that 65% of teachers reported little to no preparation in meeting the needs of gifted students. And the numbers are even higher for teachers coming out of pre-service programs. There's little to no coverage in pre-service programs on supporting high ability students or students who have already mastered grade level content. So building knowledge about gifted and talented students and using the MTSS infrastructure to build capacity is going to go a long way towards not only helping teacher efficacy, but helping the students as well. Layered continuums of support. This is something that is really, really missing in high ability education. When we think about 99% of high ability programs, after a student is identified as gifted, they are put into the district's or school's HAL program. And usually that's kind of a one size fits all or a one track. And once they're in, you're in for life and it's never reassessed again. And it may not always meet the needs of those students, especially because they have a wide range of performance levels. So tiered programs allow those needs to be met based on their strengths, their weaknesses, and their performance levels. So my graphic is not as nice as Tessa's and the MTSS teams, but this is adapted from the Iowa Department of Education. They kind of laid out a little bit what this looks like for high ability learners. And so most of their needs can be met with strong evidence-based differentiation in the core, but the differentiation has to be implemented with fidelity and be high quality. So in this bottom level, in this core level, if we differentiate the curriculum appropriately, that really does improve gifted outcomes because they're receiving services all day and they're meeting their needs all day long. So some students, in addition to having their classroom level differentiation, will need those tier 2 supports. And so that's kind of what we see when we think about pull-out programs where the HAL teacher comes in and pulls somebody out for 45 minutes, or mentorship projects. So maybe once they're in the older grades, finding them a mentor in the community or a mentor they can Zoom with in order to kind of expand their knowledge in their chosen subject. And then we have some students that need those really increasingly intensive interventions at the top. With continual monitoring and data, a lot of times we can decide if things like acceleration, whole or subject-based acceleration are appropriate for a student, or maybe an independent study for a whole semester, or an intensive intervention where they're out doing things in the field versus sitting in the classroom. So that's the idea of the kind of layered continuums of support for high ability learners. Instead of most of the time, once they're identified in every subject, they're kind of just put in this middle tier, which doesn't quite get at individualized needs. And another one that is really missing for HAL is data-based decision-making. As I mentioned previously, once students are identified, we often never look at them again. They just go on through the program and we don't really follow up with it. So tracking and data progress of gifted students is forgotten. And because the assessment for gifted students may not look like tracking achievement data, we have to use other assessments in our problem solving model, such as concept mapping, sample problems, portfolios, and we need to monitor continually. So much like special education progress monitoring, we need to ensure that we are continuing to monitor gifted students. And a lot of time that monitoring comes through growth. And so if they're not making growth, or maybe they're not performing well in the gifted program, we need to decide, is this not enough for them? Is this too much for them? Do we need to change them tiers, maybe in one subject or another? And just keep that loop continual. So data monitoring, like I said, for high ability can be a little more tricky because students they're already at grade level. So there's no like set line that they're trying to reach. So it's a little bit more difficult to data monitor for them, but we still can use these 4 different assessment types, such as the universal screening tests, diagnostically administered by school psych. We can use IQ testing, we can use MAP or NSCAS. For progress monitoring, teacher observations and anecdotal data are really huge, because teachers can see what the students are doing and if they're responding to it well. We can look at rubrics and product-based performance. If they have a specialized independent project, we can look at how they are performing on those projects. Parent input is really huge because they come home and tell their parents all about school. And so getting the parent input is really important. And then we can continue to look at growth, grades, rubrics, and several other things. So it does look a little bit different for high ability students, but there are still ways to make data monitoring happen. And because high ability programs are seen as separate entities, it is often difficult to bridge gaps and provide effective services for high ability students. Most schools are already using an MTSS system, and putting that into that familiar framework is going to be really helpful. So the underlying assumption that students will grow when given responsive and effective services implies that using MTSS models in schools will improve performances for gifted and talented students. So if using MTSS with HAL, I'm predicting positive outcomes for students, and this is something that has been studied theoretically, but there have not been studies on the effectiveness of this specific intervention. So this could be used as a model, not only in Nebraska, but for other states to help them put these connections together. And so we're really excited to have Nebraska kind of on the cutting edge of this idea with MTSS. That leads me to the MTSS and HAL pilot. So in partnership with MTSS, we are going to be launching a pilot. We are looking for about 300 students. We don't know across how many schools. It depends on the school sizes that we get. But we want to understand what it takes to implement a strong MTSS for HAL with fidelity and how to support schools in implementation. So this pilot is going to consist of a 4th and 5th grade cohort of teachers and students, where in 4th grade, we give the students a test and some scales to measure their starting point. And we are going to have 5th grade teachers participate in PLs, kind of like system days training, where we talk about how to implement this system effectively. And we also will be doing coaching and doing classroom observations to help make sure that those are being implemented with fidelity. And then once that 4th grade cohort gets to 5th grade, they will have those teachers who have already been trained on how to implement the system. And we will come back and continue to observe and coach and help those teachers. And then we will test the students again at the end of 5th grade to see how much growth they made with the MTSS system. Another thing that we're doing is we're going to do pre and post interviews with teachers so that we can find out if they grew in their confidence in supporting gifted students, if they have any feedback for how to better implement the system. So we are getting all kinds of perspectives between administrators and students and teachers, and we're going to really have a great picture of what HAL looks like within an MTSS system. And I just wanted to go back to this again with Tessa. As Tessa said, these implementation stages, it's super important. This is a 2-year pilot, and at the end of 2 years, the system may not be perfect. We have this, again, forward and backwards motion of we have to first start in this exploration stage and then installation, and then we have that initial implementation before we can even get to the full implementation. And so while we are setting this pilot for 2 years, we understand that it may take longer than that to really get this right. But we are confident that this pilot will have positive outcomes, and we just want people to understand that, as Tessa said, it's not an immediate thing. We're not going to show up on site and give a PL and all of a sudden we know everything about HAL. It's going to be a process and a commitment.